10 years ago, life looked perfect for Alexander Cole. At 32, he was already the founder of a fast-growing tech company. People called him a genius, a visionary, a man destined to change the world. He lived in a tall glass apartment overlooking the city, drove cars most people only saw in magazines, and had investors waiting for just a chance to work with him. From the outside, it seemed like he had everything. But what most people didn't know was that behind those walls filled with luxury, his marriage was falling apart. Elena had been with Alexander long before the company, long before the money, and long before the endless meetings and interviews. She met him when he was still working late nights at a small shared office, drinking cheap coffee, and trying to convince people that his idea would work. She had believed in him when no one else did. Back then, they would sit on their small apartment floor eating takeout food and dreaming about the future. He promised her that when everything succeeded, they'd travel. They'd build a home full of laughter and love, and they'd never forget where they came from. But promises have a strange way of fading when life gets busy. As the company started to grow, Alexander began to change. At first, it was small things: late nights at the office, phone calls during dinner, postponed dates. Then it became weekends filled with meetings, business trips that never ended, and a constant stream of people who wanted his attention more than his wife did. He told himself it was just for a while, that once the company stabilized, he'd have more time. But a while stretched into years. Elena tried to understand. She would wait for him at home with dinner ready, only for the food to go cold. Sometimes she would fall asleep on the couch waiting for him to walk through the door. She loved him deeply, but she missed the man she had fallen in love with. The man who used to laugh easily, who used to write her notes on sticky papers, who used to dance with her in the kitchen to songs on the radio. Now, every conversation seemed to turn into an argument about priorities. Every word she said about missing him sounded in his ears like a complaint. He would tell her, "I'm doing this for us," but us was slowly disappearing from his life. One night, after another business event that ran late, Alexander came home past midnight. Elena was sitting at the dining table, waiting, her face pale and tired. The food was untouched. She looked up at him with a mixture of sadness and frustration. "Do you even know what day it is?" she asked quietly. He looked at her blankly. "It's Thursday," he said, loosening his tie. She smiled sadly. "It's our anniversary, Alex." The silence that followed was heavier than words. He stood there, guilt flickering in his eyes, but pride stopped him from apologizing. Instead, he sighed and said, "I had a bored dinner. You know how these things go." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "They always go the same way. The company always comes first." That night, for the first time, she didn't cry. She just went to bed quietly, leaving him alone at the table with the cold food. Alexander sat there, staring at the candles she had lit hours ago, now melted to nothing. Deep down, he knew he was losing her, but he didn't know how to stop. Months passed. Their conversations became shorter. The laughter vanished completely. She started spending more time at her art studio, painting alone. He buried himself deeper in work, trying to ignore the growing emptiness in their home. When they did talk, it often turned into an argument. "You don't even look at me anymore," she once said. "I'm building something important," he snapped back. "Everything I'm doing for us." She looked at him and said softly, "If it's really for us, why does it feel like I'm not part of it?" That question stayed with him for a long time, even when he pretended it didn't. But his pride wouldn't let him admit she was right. Then came the night that changed everything. It was raining hard. Alexander had just returned from a meeting that went wrong. A deal he had been chasing for months had fallen apart. His temper was short, his nerves stretched. He entered the house and saw Elena standing near the living room, her suitcase beside her. He froze. "What's that?" he asked. She didn't look at him right away. "I'm leaving, Alex," he laughed bitterly. "Leaving? Because I'm working too much?" "Because you stopped being here," she said quietly. "I don't even recognize you anymore. The man I married would rather lose a deal than lose me. This man doesn't even notice he already has." He stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "So that's it? You're giving up?" She looked him in the eyes. "No, Alex, you did. You gave up on us long before I packed this bag." He stood there, angry and hurt, but he didn't stop her. His pride wouldn't let him. In his mind, he told himself she would come back, that she was just being emotional. But she didn't. She walked out that night quietly without looking back. He watched her leave, thinking he'd call her in a few days when things cooled down. He didn't realize that a few days would turn into 10 years. The first few weeks were strange. The house felt too big, too quiet. He told himself he preferred it that way. More space to think, more time to focus. But every time he came home, he'd catch himself expecting to hear her voice, or the sound of her humming while she painted. Sometimes he would find her old coffee mug in the cupboard and feel a sudden ache in his chest. He threw himself into work harder than ever, trying to bury the loneliness under meetings, deadlines, and success. Within 2 years, his company went public. He became a billionaire overnight. The media loved his story, the genius who built an empire from nothing. His face appeared in magazines, his name mentioned in business schools. People called him unstoppable. He had everything he once dreamed of. But when he sat alone in his penthouse at night, staring at the city lights, he realized there was no one to share it with. Friends and colleagues encouraged him to move on, to start dating again. He did, half-heartedly. The women he met were beautiful and ambitious, but the conversations were shallow, and the laughter felt forced. No one understood him the way Elena did. Sometimes he would dream of her. The way she smiled when she painted, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. He would wake up with a heaviness he couldn't explain. He thought about finding her once. He even asked his assistant to look into where she might be. But when the report came back, he couldn't bring himself to open it. Maybe he was afraid. Afraid to see she had moved on. Afraid to face what he had done. Years went by. His success grew, but so did the emptiness. He started giving speeches about leadership and success, telling young entrepreneurs to never lose focus. But deep down, he knew he had lost focus on the one thing that truly mattered. He had lost himself. Sometimes he would look at old photos, the two of them smiling in that tiny apartment, sitting on the floor eating noodles. He remembered how happy he had been back then, when they had nothing. Now he had everything, and yet he felt poorer than ever. One evening, after a long board meeting, Alexander sat alone in his office, staring at the city skyline. He wondered where she was. Was she happy? Did she still think of him sometimes? Or had she built a new life, one where he didn't exist? He didn't know. But he knew one thing. He missed her, more than he wanted to admit. That night, he walked home instead of taking the car. The air was cold, the streets quiet. He thought about how fast 10 years had passed, how quickly dreams could turn into regrets. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had been chasing the wrong kind of success. He had built towers out of money but lost the foundation that made life worth living. And as he stood at a crosswalk, watching the light change, he whispered softly to himself, maybe I wasn't building for us after all. But even then, he had no idea that fate had plans of its own. That one random day, a simple visit to a mall would bring his past back to him in the most unexpected way. He had no idea that the woman he once loved, the one he let go, was out there, raising 2 children who shared his eyes, his smile, and a part of him he never knew existed. For now, though, he just walked on, his reflection blending with the city lights, a man who had everything the world could offer but had quietly lost the only thing that truly mattered: love. 10 years had passed since Elena left. Life had moved forward, but for Alexander, it often felt like time had stopped somewhere back in that quiet living room, the night she walked away. He had built an empire, yes, but there was always that invisible space beside him, a space that money could never fill. Every morning he woke up to the sound of his alarm echoing through an empty penthouse. He had people around him all the time, assistants, managers, security. Yet the silence that followed him home each night was deafening. He often sat by the window with a glass of water in hand, watching the city lights flicker. He had once told Elena that those lights reminded him of dreams. Now they just reminded him of everything he'd lost. People admired him. They saw a billionaire who could buy anything, who spoke with confidence and authority. But no one saw the man behind the sharp suit, a man who sometimes scrolled through old photos just to remember what genuine happiness looked like. There were times he almost reached for his phone, wanting to call her just to hear her voice again. But each time he stopped himself. Pride still whispered in his ear, that same pride that had cost him his marriage. He told himself it was too late anyway, that she had surely moved on, and she had in her own quiet way. Elena had left the city behind soon after the divorce. She found herself in a small coastal town a few hours away, a place with calm streets, friendly faces, and air that didn't smell of stress. She started over with nothing but her savings, her art supplies, and the courage to begin again. For months, she rented a small room above a cafe. She painted during the day and helped in the cafe during the evenings. People liked her. She had a gentle, kind presence, the kind that made others feel at ease. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life. And then, a few months later, she found out she was pregnant. At first, she thought it couldn't be possible. But when the test came back positive, she sat there for hours, staring at it with trembling hands. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind: fear, confusion, disbelief, and a tiny spark of hope. She wanted to call Alexander, to tell him he was going to be a father. But when she thought about the distance between them, the coldness that had replaced their love, she decided against it. She whispered to herself, "I'll do this on my own." The next 9 months were both difficult and beautiful. She had no one to lean on, yet she found strength she didn't know she had. She continued painting, saving every bit she could, preparing for 2 little lives she hadn't expected. The doctor told her she was having twins, and for a moment she laughed and cried all at once. She didn't know how she would manage, but she promised herself that her children would grow up surrounded by love, even if it came only from her. When the twins were born, she named them Ethan and Ella. The first time she held them, she cried quietly, their tiny fingers wrapping around hers. They had his eyes, deep, thoughtful, and full of life. She felt a pang in her chest every time she looked at them because they reminded her of Alexander, but they also gave her a new reason to live. Raising twins alone wasn't easy. There were nights when both cried at once and she had to rock one in her arms while humming softly to calm the other. There were mornings when she barely had time to eat before heading to work at the small art school that had hired her. But she never complained. Every struggle felt worth it when she saw them smile, when she heard their laughter fill the house. Over time, the town became her home. People there adored her children. The cafe owner, Mrs. Larkin, often watched them when Elena had late classes. The neighbors helped too. They were kind people who didn't ask too many questions about her past. Though some wondered why the twins didn't have a father around, when people asked, she would simply say, "He's not part of our life anymore," and leave it at that. Ethan was the curious one, always asking questions, always wanting to fix things around the house. He was quiet like his father, but his silence was thoughtful, not cold. Ella, on the other hand, was the lively one, full of laughter and stories. She loved to paint just like her mother. Together they made the small house come alive with color and joy. Sometimes, on quiet nights after putting them to bed, Elena would sit by the window and look at the moon. She often wondered if Alexander ever thought about her. Did he ever regret it? Did he ever miss her? She told herself it didn't matter anymore. Her world now was here, 2 little hearts who loved her unconditionally. Meanwhile, back in the city, Alexander's success had reached unbelievable heights. His company had expanded overseas. He was featured in magazines, invited to speak at conferences, and praised as one of the most influential business leaders of his time. But fame came with a price: loneliness. He had everything but no one to share it with. He sometimes attended charity galas where women approached him with smiles that looked rehearsed. Conversations were polite, calculated. He could tell they saw the billionaire, not the man. One evening, after a long interview, he returned home to find his apartment spotless but lifeless. His assistant had left some documents on the table along with a newspaper. The headline read, "Success at All Costs, the Story of Alexander Cole." He laughed quietly to himself. The words hit too close to home. Success at all costs. Yes, that was exactly what he had done. And the cost had been his happiness. He started spending more time outside his routine, visiting places he hadn't been in years. Sometimes he'd walk through art galleries remembering how much Elena loved to paint. He'd stand in front of a canvas for a long time, trying to understand what the artist had felt. He began donating quietly to schools and art programs. It gave him a strange comfort, like giving something back to the world he had taken so much from. He also began avoiding interviews that focused on his personal life. Whenever journalists asked about marriage or family, he would smile politely and say, "Work keeps me busy." But inside, he knew it wasn't work keeping him busy. It was regret. One cold morning, his company sponsored a children's charity event in a small coastal town. He didn't plan to attend at first, but something in him wanted a change of scenery. He told his driver to cancel his meetings and take him there instead. As the car drove past the ocean, something in him softened. It had been years since he'd felt this calm. The air smelled of salt and rain, and the sound of waves reminded him of peace. In that same town, Elena was preparing for her art students' exhibition. The event was held at the local mall, where the children's paintings would be displayed. Ethan and Ella were excited. Both had their artwork chosen for the show. Elena smiled as she watched them run around, full of energy, helping set up decorations. She wore a simple white dress with paint stains she couldn't quite wash off. To her, it didn't matter. This was her life now, imperfect, simple, and beautiful. By noon, the mall was filled with people, parents, teachers, and visitors admiring the art. Elena stood near the display, greeting parents and answering questions about her students. She didn't notice that a familiar figure had just entered the mall from the far side. Alexander walked in quietly, accompanied by his assistant, who explained the event details. He wasn't paying much attention until he noticed a section filled with children's paintings. Something about that corner drew him in. Maybe the laughter, maybe the warmth in the air. He walked closer, his steps slowing. Then he saw her. For a second, his mind went blank. There she was, Elena, standing gracefully, smiling, talking to someone as sunlight fell across her face. She looked older, but still beautiful in a way that time couldn't change. He stood frozen, unable to move. Memories rushed back, their tiny apartment, her laughter, the night she left. And then his eyes shifted to two teenagers standing beside her. They were arranging some paintings, laughing, their voices full of life. The boy looked up for a moment, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same way he tilted his head when he thought. The girl turned next, her hair falling over her shoulders, smiling brightly as she spoke to her mother. It was like looking at two reflections of himself and Elena combined. He felt his heart pound. 1,000 questions flooded his mind, but words refused to come. He watched from a distance, trying to convince himself it couldn't be possible. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he was imagining things. But when the boy laughed again, Alexander knew he wasn't imagining anything. He stepped back slightly, his thoughts spinning. His assistant asked, "Sir, are you all right?" He nodded slowly, unable to speak. He wanted to approach them, to say something, anything, but his feet felt glued to the ground. The noise of the crowd faded as his heartbeat grew louder in his ears. He took one more look, at Elena, at the twins, and a wave of emotions hit him all at once. Regret, shock, wonder, fear. He left quietly, without speaking to anyone. That night, he sat in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. The boy's eyes, the girl's smile, Elena's calmness. He knew deep down what it meant, even before asking. They were his children. For the first time in years, Alexander couldn't think about work or success. His mind was consumed by one thing, the truth he had been blind to for a decade. Somewhere out there, he had a family he never knew. And as he sat by the window, watching the moonlight reflect on the sea, he whispered to himself, "What have I done?" Alexander couldn't sleep that night. The image of Elena standing in that mall with the twins wouldn't leave his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, the same eyes, the same smile he once loved. The boy's expression, the girl's laughter, they carried a piece of him, and he knew it. He felt something deep inside that he hadn't felt in years, a mix of guilt, shock, and longing. He kept asking himself if it was really true. Could those children really be his? Was it just a coincidence? But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. There were no coincidences like that. The next morning, he sat by the hotel window, staring out at the sea. The calm waves only made the storm inside him worse. He had spent a decade building an empire. Yet in one afternoon, everything he thought he knew about his life had changed. He wanted to see her again. He wanted to ask her, to hear it from her lips, but he didn't know how. What would he even say? "Hi, Elena, are those my kids?" It sounded ridiculous. And what right did he have after all these years to show up and question her life? Still, he couldn't walk away. He asked his assistant to extend the hotel stay for a few more days. He told everyone back at the office that he needed time to rest. It was the first time in years he had canceled work for something personal. That afternoon, he drove to the mall again, hoping to see her. Maybe he would get a chance to talk, or at least see where she worked. He didn't know what he was expecting, but something inside told him he had to understand. He had to know the truth. When he reached the mall, it was quieter than before. The children's art display had been taken down, and only a few people were walking around. His heart sank. He looked around, but she wasn't there. He almost turned to leave, but then he saw her, walking out of a small art shop near the exit. She was carrying a few rolled-up canvases under her arm. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she looked tired but peaceful. For a moment, he just watched her. 10 years, and she still carried herself with that same quiet grace, the same calm energy that used to make him feel at home. He felt a lump in his throat as memories flooded back. Without thinking, he took a few steps forward. She turned slightly, noticing someone approaching. When their eyes met, her expression froze. Time seemed to stop between them. "Alex," she said softly, disbelief in her voice. He didn't know what to say. For a second, he couldn't even breathe. "Elena," he finally managed to whisper. There was a long silence. People passed by, unaware that a decade of pain and unfinished words hung between two people standing there. He gave a faint smile, trying to find his voice. "It's been a long time." "Yes," she said quietly. "A very long time." He looked at the canvases in her hands and then back at her. "You're still painting," she nodded. "It's what I do now. I teach art at the local school." He smiled slightly. "That sounds like you." There was another silence. It wasn't cold, just heavy. He wanted to ask everything, what and where she'd been, how she'd been, if those children were really his. But he didn't want to sound like he had any right to know. "I didn't expect to see you here," she said finally, her tone polite but cautious. "I didn't expect it either," he said honestly. "My company sponsored an event. I came to visit and I saw you." She looked down, adjusting the papers in her hand. "I see." He hesitated before asking softly, "Those children with you yesterday, are they—" She stopped him gently. "Please, not here." Her tone wasn't angry, but it was firm. She looked around. There were people nearby. Then she said quietly, "There's a small cafe down the street. Meet me there in an hour. If you really want to talk." He nodded immediately. "I'll be there." When she walked away, he exhaled deeply, realizing he'd been holding his breath the entire time. His heart was racing like he was meeting her for the first time again. An hour later, he arrived at the cafe early. It was a small, cozy place, the kind that smelled like coffee and warm bread. He sat by the window, waiting. He kept checking the door every few seconds, nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. When she walked in, wearing a simple blue sweater and carrying her bag, he stood up. She smiled faintly, polite, guarded. She sat across from him, and for a moment neither spoke. Finally, he said, "Thank you for meeting me." She nodded. "I didn't think you'd still want to talk." "I've wanted to talk for years," he admitted. "I just never knew how." She looked at him for a long moment as if studying his face. "You look different, older." He gave a small, sad laugh. "I could say the same about you. But you look peaceful, happier." "I am," she said simply. "Life's not perfect, but it's honest now. I have what I need." He hesitated. "Those kids—" Her eyes softened, but she didn't look surprised. "You saw them?" "Yes, yesterday. I didn't mean to. I was just there for the event, and then—" He took a breath. "Elena, they look like me." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stirred her coffee slowly, as if trying to find the right words. Finally, she said quietly, "They're your children, Alex." He felt the world tilt slightly. Hearing her say it made it real, painfully real. "How old are they?" he asked, his voice low. 10, she said softly. "They were born a few months after I left." He closed his eyes for a second, guilt washing over him like a wave. "You didn't tell me." She shook her head. "I didn't. I thought about it many times. But what would it have changed? You were already gone. Not just from me, but from everything that mattered. I didn't want to raise them in that world of pressure and distance. I wanted them to have peace. He swallowed hard. You had every right to tell me. You would have what? She interrupted gently. Sent money? Tried to control things from afar? Alex, you were married to your company back then. You didn't even notice when I was slipping away. I couldn't bring children into that. Her words hit him deeply. He looked down, his voice breaking. You're right. I was selfish, she sighed, her expression softening. You were lost. And so was I, but it doesn't matter anymore. They're happy, they're healthy, and they don't need anything. He looked up. They don't need anything, but I need them. I need to know them. Her eyes filled with emotion, but she kept her tone calm. I understand. But you can't just walk in after 10 years and expect it to be simple. They don't know who you are. He nodded slowly. I don't expect it to be simple. I just want a chance. Please, Elena. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to try. She looked away, thinking. The cafe was quiet around them. Outside, people walked past, unaware of the storm happening between two old lovers at a corner table. Finally, she said, I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And for now, that was enough for him. They talked for a while longer, not about the past, but about little things. Her work, the town, the twins' interests. She told him that Ethan loved science and fixing things while Ella loved painting and stories. As she spoke, he listened carefully, absorbing every detail like it was a precious gift. Before leaving, he said softly, Thank you. For raising them. For everything you've done. She gave a small, tired smile. They're my whole world, he hesitated. Maybe one day. They can be mine too. She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him she hadn't closed the door completely. When she left the cafe, Alexander sat there for a long time, lost in thought. He replayed every word she'd said. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't filled with numbers or meetings. It was filled with faces, laughter, and memories of what could have been. Later that evening, he walked near the school where she taught. From a distance, he saw the twins walking home with their mother, laughing and holding her hands. He stayed far enough that they wouldn't see him, but close enough to watch. His heart swelled with emotions he couldn't describe. He realized something then. All his money, his success, his reputation. None of it mattered. What mattered were those three people walking down the street, unaware that he was watching, unaware that they had just given him back a reason to live. He promised himself that night that he wouldn't let this chance slip away again. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to be part of their lives, even if it took time, even if it meant starting from nothing again. And as the sun set behind the small coastal town, Alexander stood there, a man who had everything and nothing at once, whispering quietly, I won't lose them again. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in 10 years, he finally felt something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. After meeting Elena at the cafe, Alexander's world changed. For days he couldn't think of anything else. He went through meetings, interviews, and business calls, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. In that quiet cafe, hearing Elena's voice tell him the truth he had never expected. He had children. 2 beautiful children who had grown up without him, who had no idea who he was. That thought haunted him every second. It wasn't just guilt. It was emptiness. For years he had told himself that everything he'd sacrificed had been worth it. But now all he could see was everything he had missed. Their first steps, their first words, their birthdays, the sound of them calling someone else father. The thought broke him. He stayed in town longer than planned, telling his assistant he needed to oversee a local partnership. It was a lie, but he didn't care. For the first time, he wasn't chasing profits or deals. He was chasing something far more important, a chance to be part of his children's lives. Every morning he would walk by the art school, watching from a distance. Sometimes he saw Elena teaching her students. Sometimes he saw the twins leaving for class. He never approached them directly. He just watched quietly, learning little pieces about their lives from afar. Ethan was just like him, focused, thoughtful, and observant. Alexander noticed how he often helped other kids fix their art stands or carry heavy boxes. He had a calm confidence that made Alexander's heart ache with pride and sadness at the same time. Ella, on the other hand, reminded him of Elena. Bright, expressive, and full of color. She laughed easily, spoke kindly to everyone, and seemed to see beauty in the smallest things. Sometimes Alexander caught himself smiling without realizing it, just watching her talk excitedly about her paintings. He wished he could walk up and say, "I'm your father," but he knew it wasn't that simple. He had missed too many years. He couldn't just show up and expect them to understand. One afternoon, as he stood near the park where the twins often played, he saw Elena sitting on a bench, reading a book while keeping an eye on them. He hesitated for a long time, then gathered the courage to approach her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked softly. She looked up, surprised but not angry. "Sure," she said, closing her book. He sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. For a while, neither spoke. They just watched the twins running around laughing. "They're amazing," he said quietly. "They are," she replied. "They keep me going," he nodded. "I can see that." After a pause, he added, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I wasn't there. You're right. I can't change that. But I want to be here now, not to take them away from you, not to disrupt their lives, but just to know them." She looked at him, her expression soft but cautious. "I believe you mean that. But Alex, they don't know you. To them, I'm their only parent. You walking in suddenly could confuse them." "I know," he said. "I don't want to rush anything. I just want to start somewhere. Maybe they could meet me as a friend? Someone from your work, maybe?" Elena looked uncertain. "You really think you can just be a friend to them?" He gave a sad smile. "If that's what it takes to be in their lives, yes. I'll take anything." She studied his face for a moment. He looked tired, but there was a sincerity in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The man sitting beside her wasn't the same person she left years ago. The arrogance and pride were gone. What remained was someone humble, remorseful, and real. Finally, she said, "All right, I'll think about it. But if I agree, you follow my lead. You don't tell them anything unless I decide it's time." He nodded immediately. "I promise." The following weekend, she introduced him to the twins at a community art event. She told them he was an old friend who had helped support the art program. The twins were polite but curious. "Are you the one who helped with the school funding?" Ethan asked. Alexander smiled. "Yes, a little bit. Your mom told me she teaches some very talented students here." Ella grinned. "She says that about everyone." Elena laughed softly. "That's because I mean it." As the day went on, Alexander helped them arrange the paintings, talked to them about their artwork, and listened to their stories. The kids warmed up to him quickly. He had a natural way with them. Not forced, not awkward, just gentle and genuine. He felt an unexplainable joy watching them laugh. It was something he hadn't felt in years, something simple and real. After the event, Elena noticed the way her children looked at him. Curious, trusting. She couldn't deny that there was something special there, something natural. It scared her a little, but it also made her heart soften. Over the next few weeks, Alexander began to see them more often. Sometimes he'd join them for lunch after art classes. Sometimes he'd help Ethan with a small project or buy painting supplies for Ella. The twins liked having him around. They started calling him Mr. Alex, and every time they said it, he smiled like it was the greatest gift in the world. Elena watched quietly from the side. Part of her was afraid that opening this door would lead to chaos, that her quiet life would be shaken again. But another part of her, the one that still remembered the man she once loved, saw how much he had changed. He was no longer the man who checked his phone every 5 minutes or looked at her with distracted eyes. Now when he was with them, he was fully there. No phone, no meetings, no rush. Just presence. One evening, after the twins had gone to bed, Alexander and Elena sat outside her porch. The sky was full of stars, and the sound of waves echoed faintly in the distance. "I can't believe how much I've missed," he said quietly. "You can't get those years back," she replied gently. "But you can be part of what's ahead, and if you're careful." He looked at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do they ever ask about their father?" "Sometimes," she said. "I told them he was someone who loved them very much but couldn't be part of their life. I didn't want them to hate you." His throat tightened. "You protected me." "I protected them," she said simply. "Children deserve peace," he nodded slowly. "Thank you for giving them that." For a long time they sat in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful, like they were both slowly healing pieces of something broken. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander became a quiet part of their world. The twins started to share things with him. Drawings, stories from school, dreams for the future. He listened to every word, storing each one like a treasure. One day, Ethan asked him a question that made his heart stop. "Mr. Alex, why do you always look at us like you know us?" Alexander froze. "What do you mean?" Ella laughed. "Yeah, you always smile like you're remembering something." He smiled gently, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe it's because you remind me of something I once lost, and seeing you makes me happy." They didn't understand completely, but they smiled, satisfied with the answer. That night, when Elena tucked them into bed, Ethan said quietly, "Mom, Mr. Alex is nice. He feels familiar." She froze for a second, then smiled softly. "That's because he's kind, sweetheart. Kind people always feel familiar." As she closed their bedroom door, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. She knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. One day they would need to know. The question was when and how. The following weekend, the twins invited Alexander to their school play. He arrived early, sitting quietly in the back. When they came on stage, dressed in colorful costumes, he felt tears welling up. They were amazing, confident, joyful, and full of life. After the show, they ran up to him. "Did you see us?" Ella asked, excited. He laughed, his eyes glistening. "You were perfect. Both of you." Elena stood nearby, watching. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that look, there was understanding, not of the past, but of the present. She saw that he truly cared. She saw the sincerity in his actions. Slowly, her fear began to fade, replaced by something she hadn't felt toward him in years. Trust. That evening, as they walked home, Ethan looked up at her and said, "Mom, Mr. Alex should come over more often." She smiled. "Maybe he will." From that day, Alexander became part of their family routine. Dinners, school events, weekend walks. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. He started to laugh again, to feel alive again. And for Elena, seeing him with the twins brought a strange kind of peace. The past had hurt them both, but maybe this was how it could heal, not by erasing it, but by building something better over it. As weeks passed, Alexander noticed something changing inside him. For the first time, he didn't care about deals or deadlines. He even handed over part of his company management to his team so he could spend more time in town. He wanted to be around, not for success, not for reputation, but for them. And though Elena didn't say it out loud, he could sense her slowly letting him in again, not as the man he once was, but as the man he had become one evening. As they watched the twins play in the garden, she said quietly, "You've changed, Alex." He looked at her and smiled. "You're the reason I wanted to." She looked at him for a long moment, then turned back toward the twins. "Just don't hurt them. Or me. I won't," he said softly. "Not again." In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile hope, the kind that only comes after years of pain and silence. Neither of them knew what the future would hold. But one thing was certain. The walls that once stood between them were starting to fall. And as the evening breeze carried the laughter of their children through the air, Alexander realized that for the first time in 10 long years, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The months that followed brought quiet changes, the kind that grow slowly but change everything. Alexander had started coming over more often, helping the twins with school projects, joining them for dinner, and sometimes staying late just to talk with Elena after the kids had gone to bed. The house, which once echoed with only the soft sounds of laughter and clinking dishes, now felt alive in a different way. There was a new warmth in the air, something that had been missing for years. Every time Alexander visited, the twins would rush to the door calling out, "Mr. Alex is here." It had become a small tradition, their happy announcement followed by his soft laugh as he carried a bag of snacks or art supplies for them. Elena would watch them from the kitchen, her heart caught between joy and worry. She had begun to see how much her children cared for him. It was both beautiful and terrifying. She knew one day the truth would have to come out. One Saturday morning, they decided to go on a short trip to the nearby beach. The twins were thrilled. They spent the morning collecting seashells and building sandcastles, while Alexander helped them dig trenches and build little towers. At one point, he sat quietly watching them, the ocean wind ruffling his hair. Elena noticed the way his eyes followed every move the twins made. Pride, affection, and something deeper all mixed together. "You look happy," she said as she sat beside him. He smiled. "I am. I didn't think I could ever feel this kind of peace again." She looked at the waves. "You used to chase storms. Now you're watching the tide." He laughed softly. "Maybe I've finally learned what really matters." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Elena, can I ask something?" She nodded. "Do you ever regret not telling me about them earlier?" She looked down at the sand. "Sometimes. But I was scared. You were different then. You wouldn't have had time for them, for me. You were always somewhere else, in your work, your meetings, your dreams." He nodded, understanding. "You were right. I wouldn't have been ready. I thought success was everything, but now, when I see them, I realize how much I missed. Every laugh, every story, every little moment." Elena turned to him. "You can't get those years back, Alex." "I know," he said quietly, "but I can make sure I don't lose what's left." They sat in silence, watching the twins play near the water. The sun began to set, painting the sky with colors that seemed too perfect to be real. It was one of those rare evenings where time felt like it slowed down, letting them breathe. Later that evening, they stopped for ice cream on their way home. Ethan and Ella argued playfully about which flavor was better, and Alexander laughed, joining their banter. Elena watched him and thought about how different he was now, more patient, more grounded. The man she had once loved had finally learned to slow down. That night, after dropping them home, Alexander lingered at the gate. The kids had gone inside, and Elena stood with him for a moment under the porch light. "Thank you for letting me be part of their lives," he said softly. "You don't know what this means to me." She gave a small smile. "They're happier with you around." "I can see it," he looked down. "I keep wondering if I deserve it and if I deserve them or you." Elena's eyes softened. "You're trying. That's what matters now." He nodded slowly. "I'll never stop trying." In the weeks that followed, life fell into a rhythm. Alexander began visiting the twins' school, helping with charity programs, attending their games, and even cooking with them on weekends. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Then one evening, everything changed. Ethan came home early from school, holding an old photo in his hand, a picture he'd found in a box at the art center. It was of Elena and Alexander years ago, smiling together. "Mom," he asked quietly, "why do you have a picture of Mr. Alex from when you were young?" Elena froze. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. Ella walked in, peeking at the photo. "Whoa, that's you, Mom. And Mr. Alex. You two look close." Elena sat down, her hands trembling slightly. She had known this day would come, but she wasn't ready. "Kids," she said softly, "there's something I need to tell you." Their eyes widened, curious and confused. "Mr. Alex isn't just a friend," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "He's your father." The words hung in the air like a wave crashing in slow motion. The twins looked at her, then at the picture again. Ethan's face twisted in disbelief. "What? No way." "You mean, yes," she said. "He's your dad." Ella's eyes filled with tears. "But why didn't you tell us?" Elena took a deep breath. "Because I wanted to protect you. When we separated, things were hard. He wasn't the man he is now. I wanted you both to have peace, not confusion." Just then, Alexander arrived at the door. He could sense something was wrong the moment he saw their faces. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. Ethan held up the photo. "Is this true? Are you our dad?" Alexander froze. His throat went dry. He looked at Elena, who nodded silently. He took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Yes," he said softly. "I'm your father." For a long time, no one spoke. Then Ella whispered, "Why didn't you come for us?" The question pierced him like a knife. He knelt down, looking at them with tears in his eyes. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't know you existed until recently. If I had known, I would have done anything to be with you." Ethan looked down, silent. Ella started crying softly, and Alexander reached out, hesitating before gently hugging her. After a moment, Ethan joined too. The three of them held each other for a long time, tears mixing with words that didn't need to be spoken. Elena watched them, tears running down her cheeks. For years, she had imagined how this moment would go, feared it, dreaded it. But now, seeing them together, she realized something powerful. It was time. That night, after the twins had gone to bed, she and Alexander sat in the living room. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she said, "It's done." "They know," he nodded. "I'm sorry it came out that way." "Maybe it was meant to," she said softly. They needed to know the truth. He looked at her. "Do you regret it?" She shook her head. "No, not anymore. The next few weeks were hard. The twins asked a lot of questions, some painful, some innocent. But Alexander answered everyone honestly. Slowly, they began to trust him again, not just as Mr. Alex, but as their father. One evening, Ethan handed him a drawing he had made, a picture of their family. All four of them standing together, smiling. Alexander stared at it for a long moment, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the best gift I've ever gotten," Ethan grinned. "Then you better not lose it." He smiled through tears. "I won't. Ever." Life settled again, but it was different now. Better. Alexander still had his company, his wealth, his success. But none of it mattered the way it used to. His mornings began with phone calls to the twins before school. His evenings were often spent with them and Elena, sharing meals, laughter, and simple stories about their days. He had finally learned the value of presence, something no amount of money could buy. Months later, the twins' school held a Parents' Day event. Alexander stood proudly beside Elena, cheering for them as they received awards for their artwork. When Ethan gave a small speech and thanked both my parents, Alexander couldn't hold back his tears. After the ceremony, as they walked through the park together, the twins ran ahead, laughing. Elena and Alexander followed slowly, walking side by side. "They're happy," she said quietly. He nodded. "So am I," she smiled faintly. "You've come a long way, Alex." He looked at her, his eyes soft. "I wouldn't have made it without you. Or them." For a while they walked in silence, listening to the laughter of their children echoing through the air. Then Alexander said almost to himself, 10 years ago, I thought I had everything, money, success, power. But I was empty inside. Now I have what really matters. I have them. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I have a second chance with you too." Elena didn't reply right away. She just looked at him, and in her eyes was something gentle. Forgiveness, maybe even love. The twins called out from ahead, waving for them to join. Alexander smiled and reached out his hand to her. She hesitated only for a moment before taking it. They walked together toward the children, the sunset glowing behind them. For the first time in a decade, Alexander felt whole, not because of what he owned, but because of who he had beside him. He looked at the twins playing in the fading light and whispered quietly, almost to himself, 10 years ago I lost everything chasing the world. Now I've found my world in what I once lost." And for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it.